Good evening and welcome to St. Peter's in Hove, and welcome to this almost final step through St. Mark's Passion narrative. We've come to the burial of Jesus. Joseph of Arimathea, we heard yesterday, asked Pilate for the body. Pilate, ascertaining that Jesus was dead, handed the body over to Joseph of Arimathea. Joseph bought a shroud, took Jesus down from the cross, wrapped him in the shroud, and laid him in a tomb which had been hewn out of the rock. He then rolled a stone against the entrance to the tomb. Mary of Magdala and Mary the mother of Joseph took note of where he was laid. So that's verses 46 and 47 of the 15th chapter of St. Mark's Gospel, which closes the chapter. So Joseph does three things. He buys a shroud, something to wrap the body in, a winding sheet to wrap the body in. Not a cheap thing to buy, quite expensive. Don't forget, in those days, textiles were very expensive. We've lived in a era of cheap textiles. In those days, textiles were very expensive. So he buys the Holy Shroud. He has Jesus taken down from the cross. Obviously, it had helpers to do that. They took Jesus down from the cross, which must have been difficult, distressing, laborious. This deposition from the cross, as it's called, has been a favourite theme in art, largely because it allows the artist to paint a very unusual composition of a corpse coming down off a cross and people up the cross, one person on a ladder, people lowering the body down, and so on and so forth. It's quite a difficult thing to paint. So it was a challenge to the artist, a way of him or her showing off their virtuoso skills. And yet at the same time, it's also a great subject for art because it's such a macabre scene, yet at the same time a peaceful scene. And because there's no more suffering, the suffering is now over. And in many ways, a scene that gives us closure. Jesus, at long last, is being handed over to the people who will care for him, even though he's now dead. Remember, the Sanhedrin handed him over to Pilate. Pilate handed him over to the executioners. Judas handed him over to the Sanhedrin. These were people who did not care about Jesus, handing him over to other people who did not care about Jesus. But now Jesus is handed over to somebody, handed down to somebody who will care for him, who will place him in a shroud, which of course he cannot feel, but nevertheless a shroud which is important for the dignity of the body, and then wrapped him up and placed him in a tomb which had been hewn out of the rock. An important tomb, rather. Well, you see these tombs all over the world, really. I've seen several of them. There were quite a few in my childhood in Malta. We used to call them the Punic tombs. And it was basically sort of like an artificial cave. And then he puts the stone over the cave. So Jesus is now in a safe place. The body is in a safe place. Then we're told Mary of Magdala and Mary, the mother of Joseph, took note of where he was laid. What on earth is this? Well, this is interesting because, again, it's something that you might not realise. There was no grave marker. Now, in England, we always have grave markers. As soon as somebody is buried, there's a marker put on the grave saying who's in the grave. Then later, when the soil is settled, we have we put a permanent memorial up there. They didn't have these memorials, it seems, in these days. Jesus was put in a tomb which was not marked with his name. But Mary of Magdala and Mary, the mother of Joseph, took note of where he was laid. They realized that was the tomb. Now, there's a parallel here. In the days of the persecution of the church, the martyrs were buried in the catacombs, secretly buried. But people remembered where they'd been buried. And when the persecution of the church was over, their tombs were decorated with inscriptions about their martyrdom, mainly by Pope Damasus I, which was about 200 years later. In other words, it was passed on through oral tradition. So these two women look at the tomb and say, that is where the Lord has been laid, and they remember it so that they can go back to it. And so that when the resurrection comes, it really is this tomb. They saw the dead Christ go into this tomb, and it is out of this tomb that the live Christ, the risen Christ, will come. In other words, there's a perfect continuity between Jesus who lived on this earth and who died on this earth, and Jesus who rose again from the tomb to new life. In other words, there's not the Jesus who comes out of the tomb. It's not a new Jesus or an coming out of some other tomb and so on. There is a continuity between the two. So Mary of Magdala and Mary, the mother of Joseph, we've lost Salome, who was the other woman, and the other women. They took note of where he was laid. And of course, they will also take note of the resurrection when that follows. It's there we close it for now. Well, I'll have more reflections, I think, tomorrow, but let us leave Jesus in his tomb. Let us pray that our lives may be buried with Christ so that we too may rise again. All the best. Bye.